Steam rose from the untouched pepperoni pizza as 7-year-old Hazel traced careful hearts on her napkin, her pink tongue darting out in pure concentration. The warm hum of Saturday evening conversations at Pine Grove Restaurant dissolved into chaos when savage voices erupted from the shadows of corner booth 12. "Pay up, you filthy bitch!" Two hulking figures pinned a raven-haired woman against the cracked vinyl, her delicate frame trembling like a wounded bird. Her leather purse tumbled to the worn linoleum, spilling documents that fluttered down like autumn leaves. Silence strangled the room. 50 pairs of eyes watched. 50 souls turned away. "Daddy!" Hazel's tiny fingers found his wrist, her voice fragile as spun glass. "Can we help her?" Alex Carter had built his life on safety, on routine, on protecting what remained of his small family. But something shattered inside him at those 5 desperate words, something that made him rise from their red vinyl booth, despite the warning bells screaming in his head. He couldn't know that this single act of courage would unleash a nightmare that had been hunting them long before they ever sat down for pizza. Alex's chair scraped against the sticky floor as he stood, his carpenter's hands steady, despite the tremor in his chest. The taller attacker, a mountain of muscle with snake tattoos crawling up his forearms, turned at the sound. His bloodshot eyes locked onto Alex with the predatory focus of a wolf sizing up prey. "Mind your own business, woodworker," he snarled, somehow knowing Alex's profession from his work-stained flannel shirt. The second man, shorter but broader, kept his meaty grip on the woman's wrist while she whimpered like a cornered animal. Her dark eyes found Alex's across the smoky distance, and he saw something there beyond terror, a flicker of desperate hope that made his protective instincts roar to life. "Let her go," Alex said, his voice steadier than he felt. The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down in an old Western saloon. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to sit back down, to grab Hazel and disappear into the safety of their routine Saturday night. But his daughter's wide brown eyes held him captive, reflecting a faith in him that he wasn't sure he deserved. The woman's lips moved soundlessly, forming what looked like the word please. Her mascara had run in thin black rivers down her pale cheeks, and Alex noticed her expensive-looking jewelry, diamond earrings that caught the fluorescent light, and a gold bracelet that seemed out of place on someone being shaken down for money. The snake-tattooed giant laughed, a sound like grinding metal that sent ice through Alex's veins. "You got kids to worry about, family man. Walk away before you make this real ugly." His partner's grip tightened on the woman until she gasped, and Alex saw her knees buckle slightly. The threat wasn't just words. These men radiated the kind of violence that came from practice, from knowing exactly how much pressure it took to break bones. Around them, the restaurant had gone silent except for the anxious whisper of shifting vinyl seats and the distant clatter of dishes being hastily abandoned in the kitchen. Even the teenage waitress had vanished behind the counter, probably calling the police with trembling fingers. Alex took another step forward, his boots crunching on scattered ice from someone's abandoned drink. "I said let her go." This time his voice carried the quiet authority he used when teaching Hazel right from wrong, the tone that brooked no argument. The woman's eyes widened with something that might have been recognition, though Alex was certain he'd never seen her before in his life. Her lips parted as if to speak, but the shorter thug's hand clamped over her mouth before any sound escaped. The smell of cigarettes and cheap cologne rolled off the men in waves, mixing with the restaurant's usual aroma of grease and disinfectant to create something nauseating that made Alex's stomach clench. "Daddy, no," Hazel whispered behind him, but her voice carried a different quality now, not fear for herself, but fear for him. The realization hit Alex like a physical blow. His 7-year-old daughter was more worried about his safety than her own. He could hear her small feet shuffling against the floor, probably clutching that ratty stuffed rabbit she still carried everywhere despite being too old for such things. The weight of her love pressed against his shoulders like armor, making him feel both invincible and terrifyingly vulnerable at the same time. The snake-tattooed man reached into his jacket, and Alex's world narrowed to a single point of focus. Time stretched like taffy as his mind catalogued every detail, the way the man's scarred knuckles flexed, the slight bulge under his armpit that suggested a holster, the calculating gleam in his partner's piggy eyes. But before metal could clear leather, the restaurant's front door burst open with a bang that made everyone jump. A pair of state troopers strode in, their hands resting casually on their service weapons, and the entire dynamic shifted like a house of cards in an earthquake. "Evening, folks," the lead officer said, his voice carrying the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room. "We got a call about a disturbance." His partner, a woman with steel-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing, positioned herself near the back exit while scanning the room with practiced efficiency. The two attackers released the woman so quickly she stumbled against the booth's vinyl back, gasping and rubbing her wrists where angry red marks were already forming. Snake tattoos straightened his jacket with deliberate casualness, but Alex noticed how his eyes darted toward the exits like a trapped animal looking for escape routes. "No disturbance here, officer," Snake Tattoos said, his voice now smooth as silk but somehow more menacing than his earlier growls. "Just having a friendly conversation with an old friend." He gestured toward the woman, who had gone rigid at the word friend. Her face had drained of color until she looked like porcelain under the harsh fluorescent lights, and her hands shook as she smoothed her dark hair back into place. Alex caught sight of a small, crescent-shaped scar on her left temple, the kind left by broken glass or a sharp blow, before she turned away from the officer's scrutiny. The female trooper's radio crackled with dispatch codes that Alex didn't understand, but the effect on the woman was immediate and dramatic. She flinched as if struck, her eyes darting toward the back exit with the same desperate calculation Alex had seen in the attackers' faces moments before. Something was very wrong here, more wrong than a simple shakedown or bar fight. The air in the restaurant felt charged with secrets and unspoken threats, like the heavy atmosphere before a thunderstorm. Alex found himself studying the woman's face, trying to read the story written in the tight lines around her eyes and the way she held herself as if expecting another blow. "Ma'am," the lead officer addressed the woman directly, his tone gentle but authoritative. "You okay? Need medical attention?" She shook her head quickly. Too quickly. And Alex noticed how she avoided meeting the officer's gaze. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was surprisingly cultured, with just a hint of an accent he couldn't place. "I'm fine, thank you, really. Just a misunderstanding between friends." But her eyes told a different story, one written in fear and desperation that made Alex's chest tighten with protective instincts he didn't fully understand. Something about her reminded him of a wounded sparrow he'd once found in his workshop. Beautiful, fragile, and trying desperately to hide how badly broken it was. The shorter attacker, who'd been silent since the police arrived, finally spoke up, his voice carrying a Brooklyn accent thick as molasses. "Yeah, everything's cool here. We was just leaving anyway." He dropped a $20 bill on their table with exaggerated casualness, but Alex noticed how his hand trembled slightly and how sweat beaded on his forehead despite the restaurant's aggressive air conditioning. The woman's reaction to his voice was subtle, but unmistakable. A slight flinch, a tightening around her eyes that spoke of recognition and old pain. These weren't random muggers or small-time thugs. They knew her, and whatever their history, it went deeper than money. The officers exchanged a look that spoke volumes about their years of partnership and shared experience reading dangerous situations. "Well then," the female trooper said, her hand still resting on her weapon, "we'll just wait here while everyone finishes up their business. Make sure there's no more misunderstandings." Her meaning was crystal clear. Nobody was leaving until she was satisfied that the immediate threat had passed. The two attackers' masks of casual indifference slipped slightly, revealing glimpses of frustration and barely controlled rage underneath. Snake Tattoo's jaw worked as if he were chewing something bitter, while his partner's piggy eyes darted between the officers and the woman with calculating malice. Alex remained standing, his body still positioned protectively between Hazel and the unraveled drama, but his attention was entirely focused on the mysterious woman. She was beautiful in a way that seemed almost out of place in the blue-collar restaurant. Her clothes were expensive but understated, her makeup perfect despite the tears and fear. But it was her eyes that held him captive, dark brown depths that seemed to hold years of secrets and pain. When she finally looked directly at him, Alex felt something electric pass between them, a connection that made no logical sense, but felt as real and solid as the floor beneath his feet. "Thank you," she mouthed silently, her lips barely moving, and Alex felt his heart skip a beat. Up close he could see that she was probably in her early 30s, with the kind of natural elegance that couldn't be bought or taught. A thin gold chain around her neck disappeared beneath her silk blouse, and he caught a glimpse of what looked like a small locket or pendant. Her hands, which had stopped shaking now that the immediate danger had passed, were manicured but showed small calluses that suggested she wasn't entirely the pampered princess her appearance suggested. There were layers to this woman, mysteries wrapped in expensive silk and designer perfume. The two attackers finally made their exit, moving with the forced casualness of predators temporarily thwarted, but not defeated. Snake Tattoos paused at the door, his eyes finding the woman one last time before he spoke in a voice pitched low but still audible across the suddenly quiet restaurant. "See you real soon, Katie." The name hung in the air like a threat, and Alex saw the woman, Katie, stiffen as if struck. Her composure, which had held throughout the confrontation, finally cracked, and she pressed one hand to her mouth to stifle what sounded like a sob. The officers watched the men leave, taking down license plate numbers and speaking quietly into their radios, but their presence seemed to offer little comfort to the shaken woman. As the door swung shut behind the attackers, the restaurant slowly began to return to normal. Conversations resumed in nervous whispers, silverware clinked against plates, and the teenage waitress emerged from behind the counter with the shell-shocked expression of someone who'd just witnessed something far outside her small-town experience. But Alex remained frozen in place, his eyes locked on Katie, who seemed to be struggling with some internal battle. Her chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths, and she kept glancing toward the windows as if expecting to see familiar faces pressed against the glass. "Ma'am?" The lead officer approached her table, his notebook already out. "I'm going to need you to give us a statement about what happened here tonight. Those men threatened you, and we take that seriously." Katie's face went white again, and she shook her head with a vehemence that surprised everyone. "No, please, I can't. I mean, there's nothing to report." Like they said, it was just a misunderstanding. Her voice carried a note of panic that made Alex's protective instincts flare again. Something was terribly wrong here, more wrong than a simple case of harassment or intimidation. The female officer studied Katie with the shrewd gaze of someone who'd seen every kind of victim and perpetrator in her 20-year career. "Ma'am, you look scared, real scared. If these men have been bothering you, threatening you, we can help. That's what we're here for." But Katie was already gathering her scattered belongings from the floor, her movements quick and desperate like those of someone preparing to run. The expensive leather purse that had spilled earlier held more than Alex had initially noticed. Not just the usual feminine essentials, but what looked like legal documents, a thick envelope, and something metallic that might have been a flash drive or small recording device. "I have to go," Katie said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. I can't stay. She stood on unsteady legs, clutching her purse against her chest like armor. As she turned to leave, her eyes met Alex's one more time, and he saw something there that made his chest tighten. Gratitude mixed with regret, as if she were apologizing for dragging him into something dangerous. Without thinking, he took a step toward her, some instinct urging him to offer help, protection, something to ease the terror he could see consuming her from the inside out. "Wait," Alex heard himself say, his voice carrying across the restaurant with more authority than he'd known he possessed. "Are you okay? Do you need a ride somewhere? Someone to call?" Katie paused at his words, her hand already on the door handle, and for a moment he thought she might accept his offer. Her dark eyes searched his face as if looking for something. Trustworthiness, perhaps? Or simply human kindness in a world that had shown her precious little of either. Behind him, Alex could hear Hazel's chair scraping against the floor as his daughter tried to get a better look at the mysterious woman who had disrupted their quiet Saturday evening. "You're very kind," Katie said finally, her cultured voice carrying a sadness that seemed to come from somewhere deep and wounded inside her soul. "But you have a daughter to protect. Don't get involved in this, please." The warning in her words was unmistakable, but so was the longing, as if part of her desperately wanted to accept his offer of help, despite knowing the danger it would bring. Alex felt Hazel's small hand slip into his, her fingers warm and trusting, and he was reminded of his primary responsibility. But something about Katie's situation called to him on a level that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the kind of man his father had raised him to be. "At least tell me your name," Alex said, though he already knew part of it from the attacker's parting shot. "In case the police need to follow up." It was a weak excuse, and they both knew it, but Katie seemed to appreciate the gesture. She glanced once more at the officers, who were still watching the exchange with professional interest, then back at Alex with an expression that might have been the beginning of a smile under different circumstances. "Rachel," she said softly. "Rachel Stone." The name rolled off her tongue with the practiced ease of someone who'd said it many times, but Alex noticed the slight hesitation before the surname, as if she'd almost said something else. With that, she was gone, disappearing into the darkness beyond the restaurant's neon-lit windows, like a ghost returning to whatever shadows had spawned her. Alex watched until her silhouette vanished completely, leaving him with the uncomfortable feeling that he'd just witnessed something far more significant than a random act of violence. The officers finished taking statements from other witnesses, but without Katie's cooperation, there wasn't much they could do beyond filing a report and promising to increase patrols in the area. As they prepared to leave, the female trooper approached Alex with a business card and a knowing look. "You did good tonight," she said, pressing the card into his palm. "Took guts to stand up like that. But a word of advice. That woman's in serious trouble. The kind that follows people around and doesn't let go easy. You got a little girl to think about." Her warning echoed Katie's own words, but instead of discouraging Alex, it only deepened his concern for the mysterious woman who'd asked him to call her Rachel Stone. There had been something in her eyes, some desperate appeal that spoke to the part of him that had always been drawn to fixing broken things, whether they were furniture or people. As Alex and Hazel finally settled back into their booth, the cold pizza forgotten in favor of the adrenaline still coursing through their systems, Hazel looked up at him with the solemn expression she wore when processing something important. "Daddy, why was that lady so scared?" she asked, her small voice carrying the weight of genuine concern. "And why didn't she want the police to help her?" These were complicated questions with no easy answers, especially for a 7-year-old who still believed that good always triumphed over evil and that police officers were heroes who could fix any problem. Alex chose his words carefully, aware that this conversation would help shape his daughter's understanding of a world that was far more complex and dangerous than her protected childhood had shown her so far. Sometimes grown-ups get into situations that are hard to explain, sweetheart. And sometimes people are scared for reasons that don't make sense to us. He smoothed Hazel's hair back from her face, marveling at how the simple gesture could ground him, even as his mind raced with questions about Rachel Stone and the men who seemed to know her far too well. The important thing is that we tried to help when someone needed us. "Will we see her again?" Hazel asked, and Alex felt his chest tighten at the hope in her voice. His daughter had been fascinated by the mysterious woman from the moment she'd first spoken, and he could see that Rachel Stone had made an impression that would stick with Hazel for a long time to come. "I don't know, baby. Maybe." But even as he said the words, Alex found himself hoping that they would see her again, not because he was looking for trouble, but because something about Rachel Stone had awakened a protective instinct in him that he hadn't felt since Jessica had walked out on them 4 years ago. The drive home was quiet except for the gentle hum of his truck's engine and Hazel's occasional questions about the evening's events. Alex found his mind wandering to Rachel Stone, the way she'd held herself with dignity even when frightened, the expensive quality of her clothes that suggested money but not happiness, and most of all, the bone-deep sadness in her eyes that spoke of losses he could only imagine. There had been something familiar about her fear, something that reminded him of his own feelings during those first terrible months after Jessica's departure, when every day had felt like a battle for survival and every night had brought fresh waves of doubt and loneliness. Sunday morning dawned grey and drizzly, the kind of Pacific Northwest weather that made staying inside with coffee and pancakes seem like the only rational choice. Alex went through his usual weekend routine, making breakfast while Hazel chatted about her upcoming school week, reading the local paper while she worked on homework, and generally maintaining the comfortable rhythm they'd developed over the past 4 years. But his mind kept drifting to the previous night's events, replaying every moment of his encounter with Rachel Stone and wondering what kind of trouble she was really in. It wasn't until Monday morning, when Alex stopped by Corner Coffee for his usual pre-work caffeine fix, that he got his first real clue about the mysterious woman who'd occupied his thoughts all weekend. The coffee shop buzzed with its typical Monday morning energy, commuters grabbing quick fixes before heading to offices, retired folks settling in for long conversations over multiple refills, and Brad Morrison, the owner, working his magic behind the counter with the easy efficiency of someone who'd been perfecting his craft for decades. Alex had been coming here for 3 years, ever since he'd started his carpentry business, and Brad always had his order ready before he reached the counter. "Usual?" Brad asked, already reaching for a large cup. But Alex noticed something different in his friend's demeanor, a tension around his eyes that hadn't been there on Friday. "Actually, make it 2, Alex said, not sure why he was ordering an extra coffee, but following some instinct he couldn't name. "Got a big project starting today." It wasn't entirely a lie. He did have a kitchen cabinet job beginning that afternoon, but the real reason for the second coffee remained unclear even to himself. "You hear about the excitement at Pine Grove Saturday night?" Brad asked as he worked the espresso machine, his tone carefully casual in the way of someone fishing for information without seeming to pry. Alex's attention sharpened immediately, and he found himself leaning forward across the counter. "You mean the thing with the woman and those 2 guys?" "Yeah, I was there. Saw the whole thing." Brad's eyebrows rose slightly, and Alex caught something that might have been relief flickering across his features before the coffee shop owner's professional mask slipped back into place. "The woman, tall, dark hair, really well dressed. She's been coming in here for about 2 weeks. Brad continued, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone as he handed over the 2 coffee cups. "Real quiet type. Always sits in the back corner booth, pays cash, doesn't talk much except to order. But I could tell she was running from something. Had that look, you know, like a deer that knows hunting season just opened. Alex accepted the coffees, inhaling the familiar aroma while his mind processed this new information about Rachel Stone. 2 weeks wasn't very long, but it suggested she was more than just a passing traveler. She ever say where she was from? What brought her to town? Alex asked, trying to keep his tone casual despite the urgency he felt to learn more about the woman who'd haunted his weekend thoughts. Brad shook his head, but Alex caught him glancing toward the back corner booth as if expecting to see her there. Nope. Like I said, she didn't talk much, but she tipped well, was always polite, and minded her own business. In my experience, that usually means someone's got good reason to lay low. The implication hung between them like smoke from the espresso machine, and Alex felt his protective instincts stirring again. Those guys who were hassling her, they ever come in here looking for her? Alex pressed, aware that he was probably asking too many questions but unable to stop himself. Something about Rachel Stone's situation had gotten under his skin in a way he couldn't explain, and he found himself genuinely worried about her safety. Brad's expression grew more guarded, and he glanced around the coffee shop before answering. Not here, no, but I heard through the grapevine that they've been asking around town, showing her picture to people, claiming she owed them money. Made some of the other business owners pretty uncomfortable. This was worse than Alex had imagined. If the 2 thugs from Saturday night were actively hunting Rachel Stone, it meant her fear had been completely justified. It also meant that his intervention at the restaurant might have painted a target on his own back, something he hadn't considered in the heat of the moment, but that now sent cold fingers of worry crawling up his spine. He thought of Hazel, probably sitting in her 2nd-grade classroom at that very moment, blissfully unaware that her father might have attracted the attention of dangerous men. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Brad, Alex said carefully, if she comes in again, will you let me know? I gave her my word that I'd help if she needed it, and I'd like to follow through on that. Brad studied him for a long moment, probably weighing the wisdom of getting involved in what was clearly a complicated and potentially dangerous situation. Finally, he nodded, but his expression remained troubled. Just be careful, Alex. Whatever that woman's mixed up in, it's bigger than some local trouble. Those guys Saturday night weren't small-time operators. They had that professional look, if you know what I mean. Alex knew exactly what he meant, and it made his stomach clench with anxiety. As he left the coffee shop with his 2 cups, one of which was already growing cold in his nervous grip, he found himself scanning the street for unfamiliar faces or vehicles that might be watching him. The paranoia felt foreign and uncomfortable, like wearing someone else's ill-fitting clothes, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his simple act of kindness had somehow fundamentally changed his quiet, predictable life. The question now was whether Rachel Stone would reappear, and if she did, whether he'd have the courage to help her again, despite the obvious dangers. Tuesday afternoon found Alex in his workshop behind the house, surrounded by the familiar scents of sawdust and wood stain that usually brought him peace and clarity. But today, even the rhythmic motion of hand-sanding cabinet doors couldn't quiet his restless thoughts about the mysterious woman who'd disappeared into Saturday night like smoke. He'd found himself checking the local news obsessively, half expecting to read about a body found in the river, or a car discovered burned out on some back-country road. The silence was almost worse than bad news would have been. At least then, he'd know what had happened to her. Hazel's voice calling from the house interrupted his brooding, and Alex set down his sandpaper with relief. His daughter had been asking questions about the scared lady all week, and while he'd tried to deflect her curiosity, he could see that the incident had made a deep impression on her 7-year-old mind. Children had a way of sensing when adults were holding back important information, and Hazel was particularly perceptive when it came to reading his moods and motivations. "Daddy, there's a lady at the door," Hazel announced as Alex emerged from the workshop, wiping his hands on an old towel. "She says she knows you from the restaurant." Alex's heart rate spiked immediately, and he found himself moving faster than necessary toward the front of the house. Through the living room window, he caught a glimpse of a familiar silhouette. Slender, elegant, but somehow diminished since their last encounter. Rachel Stone stood on his front porch, clutching a small purse against her chest and glancing nervously over her shoulder as if expecting pursuit. She looked different in daylight, younger somehow, but also more fragile. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail instead of the sophisticated style she'd worn at the restaurant, and she was dressed in jeans and a plain sweater that couldn't quite hide the fact that they'd probably cost more than Alex made in a week. But it was her eyes that held his attention, still beautiful, still sad, but now carrying a desperate quality that made his chest tight with concern. She'd been crying recently, he could tell, and the careful makeup from Saturday night had been replaced by the pale, raw look of someone who'd spent days running on fear and adrenaline. "Ms. Stone," Alex said as he opened the door, not bothering to hide his relief at seeing her alive and apparently unharmed. "I was wondering if you were okay. Please, come in." He stepped back to give her room to enter, but she hesitated on the threshold, her eyes darting from him to Hazel and back again. "I shouldn't be here," she said, her cultured voice barely above a whisper. "I'm putting you both in danger just by being here, but I didn't know where else to go." The admission seemed to cost her something, and Alex could see her struggling with pride and desperation in equal measure. "You're safe here," Alex heard himself say, and meant it completely, despite not having any real idea what he was promising to protect her from. "Come in, please. Let me make you some coffee, and we can talk about whatever's going on." Rachel's resistance crumbled at his gentle tone, and she stepped across his threshold with the careful movements of someone who'd been hurt recently and was still expecting more pain. Hazel, who'd been watching the exchange with the intense curiosity of childhood, immediately moved closer to their unexpected visitor. "Are you the scared lady from the restaurant?" Hazel asked, with the direct honesty that only children could get away with. "Daddy's been worried about you all week. He keeps checking his phone and looking out the window like he's waiting for someone." Alex felt his face flush at his daughter's accurate assessment of his recent behavior, but Rachel's expression softened slightly at Hazel's words. She knelt down to Hazel's eye level, and Alex noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed his daughter's hair back from her face. "I'm sorry if I scared you that night," Rachel said, her voice gentler than Alex had heard it before. "Sometimes grown-ups get into trouble, and it can be frightening for everyone around them. But your daddy was very brave to try to help me." Hazel beamed at this praise of her father, and Alex felt something warm and protective stir in his chest as he watched the two most important females in his current world interact. There was something natural about the way Rachel spoke to Hazel, not the condescending tone many adults used with children, but genuine respect for his daughter's intelligence and sensitivity. "Can you stay for dinner?" Hazel asked with the easy hospitality of childhood. "Daddy makes really good spaghetti, and we have ice cream for dessert." Rachel's eyes filled with tears at the simple invitation, and Alex realized that kindness might be something she'd been missing from her life for a long time. "That's very sweet of you, honey," Rachel said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I can't stay long. There are some bad people looking for me, and I don't want them to find me here with you and your daddy." Alex's protective instincts flared at the confirmation of what he'd already suspected, and he found himself studying the windows and doors of his small house, calculating escape routes and defensive positions with a tactical mindset he'd never needed before. "Who are they?" he asked quietly, positioning himself where he could keep an eye on both the street outside and Rachel's face. "What do they want with you?" Rachel's composure, which had been holding by the thinnest of threads since her arrival, finally cracked completely. She pressed her hands to her face and sobbed with the broken sound of someone who'd been carrying too much weight for too long. "I can't tell you," she whispered through her tears. "The less you know, the safer you'll be. I just needed somewhere to think, somewhere to feel human for a few minutes before I have to run again." Alex felt something break inside his chest at her words, and without thinking, he pulled her into his arms the way he would comfort Hazel after a nightmare. Rachel stiffened initially, then melted against him with a sigh that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. She felt smaller than she'd appeared from a distance, more fragile, and Alex could feel the rapid flutter of her heartbeat against his chest. "Whatever this is, you don't have to face it alone," he murmured into her hair, breathing in the faint scent of expensive shampoo mixed with fierce sweat and exhaustion. "I meant what I said at the restaurant. I want to help." Rachel pulled back to look at him, her dark eyes searching his face as if trying to determine whether his offer was genuine or just the kind of empty promise people made when they didn't understand the real cost of their words. "You don't know what you're saying," she said finally. "These aren't ordinary criminals. They're connected, organized, and they don't leave loose ends." The implication hit Alex like a physical blow, and he felt his world tilt slightly as the reality of Rachel's situation came into focus. This wasn't about unpaid debts or personal vendettas. This was about something much larger and more dangerous than anything his quiet, small-town life had prepared him for. Behind them, Hazel had gone silent, probably sensing the adult tension in the room, even if she didn't understand its source. Alex realized that his simple act of kindness at Pine Grove had already changed everything, whether he'd intended it to or not. The question now was whether he had the courage to see it through to whatever end awaited them. "Then we'll figure it out together," Alex said, his voice carrying more conviction than he felt, but needing to believe his own words for Hazel's sake, if nothing else. "You said there are people looking for you. How long do you think we have before they figure out where you are?" Rachel's expression grew grimmer, and she glanced toward the windows again, with the haunted look of someone who'd been running so long that caution had become second nature. "I've been careful, but they're not stupid. Maybe a day, maybe less. I shouldn't have come here at all, but I was so tired of being alone with this." Alex's mind raced as he tried to process the implications of having maybe 24 hours before dangerous people showed up at his door looking for the woman currently crying in his living room. He thought of Hazel's school, his work commitments, the normal life they'd built here over the past 4 years, and how all of it suddenly seemed as fragile as spun glass. But looking at Rachel's exhausted, frightened face, he knew he couldn't turn her away any more than he could stop breathing. Some decisions made themselves, regardless of their consequences. "Okay," he said, his voice steadier than his racing heart. "First thing we do is get Hazel somewhere safe. Then you're going to tell me everything. Who these people are, what they want, and what our options are." "And Rachel?" She looked up at him through tear-dampened lashes, and Alex felt something shift irrevocably in his chest. "My name's Alex. Alex Carter. And whatever happens next, you're not facing it alone anymore." The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when Rachel finally began to speak, her words coming in halting fragments, as if each revelation cost her something precious. They sat at Alex's kitchen table while Hazel played in her room, the illusion of normalcy maintained by the simple ritual of coffee and conversation. But there was nothing normal about what Rachel had to tell him, and with each new detail, Alex felt his understanding of his safe, predictable world crumbling like sand castles at high tide. "My real name is Catherine Morrison," she began, her cultured voice barely above a whisper. "My husband Daniel was a corporate lawyer in Portland, and I worked as a senior accountant for a company called Blackwater Industries." Alex had heard of Blackwater. They'd been in the news recently for some kind of federal investigation, though he hadn't paid much attention to the details at the time. Daniel specialized in corporate compliance, making sure companies followed federal regulations. What we didn't know was that his biggest client was using his legal advice to hide massive money laundering operations. The story that emerged over the next hour was like something from a crime thriller, except that the fear in Catherine's eyes was absolutely real. Blackwater Industries had been washing hundreds of millions in drug money through legitimate construction and real estate projects, using Daniel's legal expertise to create an impenetrable maze of shell corporations and offshore accounts. When Daniel finally realized what was happening, he'd confronted the company's executives, threatening to expose the entire operation unless they shut it down immediately. "They killed him," Catherine said, her voice flat with the kind of numbness that came from reliving trauma too many times. "Made it look like a car accident, but I knew better. Daniel was the most careful driver in the world, and his car had just been serviced the week before. But the investigators couldn't prove anything, and without Daniel's testimony, the case against Blackwater started falling apart." Alex reached across the table to cover her trembling hands with his own, offering what comfort he could, while his mind struggled to process the magnitude of what she was telling him. "That's when I decided to finish what Daniel started," Catherine continued, her eyes focusing on something beyond the kitchen windows. "I had access to all the financial records he'd been reviewing, and I understood the money trails well enough to build a case that would stick. So I copied everything, took it to the FBI, and agreed to testify in exchange for protection." Alex felt cold fingers of dread walking up his spine as he realized where this story was heading. Catherine had become a federal witness against a massive criminal organization, the kind of witness who usually ended up dead before ever reaching a courtroom. "The trial was supposed to start last month," she continued, "but 3 weeks ago someone tried to kill me in my hotel room. The marshal said my cover had been blown, that there was probably a leak somewhere in the system. They moved me to a new location, but I couldn't take it anymore. Being locked up, not knowing if the next person through my door would be there to help me or silence me permanently. So I ran." Alex was beginning to understand the desperation that had driven her to his small town, the exhaustion that had made her careless enough to sit alone in a restaurant where anyone could find her. "Those men at Pine Grove, they work for Blackwater?" Alex asked, though he already knew the answer from the haunted expression on Catherine's face. "Vincent Morrison is Daniel's brother, and Marcus Webb is his enforcer. They've been hunting me for weeks, getting closer each time. I thought I'd lost them when I came here, but somehow they tracked me down." The family connection made the betrayal even more devastating, Alex realized. She wasn't just running from criminals, she was being hunted by her late husband's own brother. "Why did they let you walk away that night?" Alex asked, remembering how easily the two men had backed down when the police arrived. "If they'd been hunting you for weeks, why not just grab you and disappear?" Catherine's smile was bitter as winter rain, and Alex saw something in her eyes that made his stomach clench with apprehension. "Because they wanted to see who would help me. They wanted to identify anyone who might be sympathetic, anyone who might give me aid or shelter. You standing up for me wasn't an act of heroism, Alex. It was walking into their trap." The realization hit him like a physical blow, and Alex felt the room spin slightly as the full implications sank in. By trying to help Catherine, he'd made himself and Hazel targets. The men who'd killed her husband wouldn't hesitate to eliminate a small-town carpenter and his 7-year-old daughter if they posed any threat to the operation. His protective instincts roared to life, but they felt inadequate against the kind of organized, professional threat Catherine was describing. "We have to call the FBI," Alex said, reaching for his phone, but Catherine's hand shot out to stop him. "No!" she said, her voice sharp with panic. "I told you there's a leak. Someone in law enforcement is feeding information to Blackwater, and until we know who it is, contacting the authorities is just giving away our position." Alex stared at her, feeling trapped between equally dangerous options, staying silent and hoping the killers didn't find them, or reaching out for help that might actually make things worse. "Then what do we do?" he asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "I've got a daughter to protect, Catherine. I can't just wait around for professional killers to show up at my door." Catherine flinched at his tone, and Alex immediately felt guilty for taking his fear out on her. She hadn't asked for any of this. She was as much a victim as he was, maybe more so. "I know," she said quietly. "That's why I have to leave, tonight. If I disappear again, maybe they'll follow me and leave you alone. And maybe they'll decide we know too much and eliminate the witnesses anyway." Alex countered, his practical mind already working through the tactical realities of their situation. "These people killed your husband for threatening to expose them. You think they'll just ignore the fact that I've seen their faces and know they're in town?" Catherine's expression crumpled as the logic of his words hit her, and Alex realized they were trapped in a nightmare with no easy exits. The sound of Hazel's laughter drifting from her bedroom provided a sharp contrast to the deadly serious conversation taking place at the kitchen table, and Alex felt the weight of his parental responsibilities pressing down on him like a physical force. His daughter's innocent joy was a reminder of everything he stood to lose, but it was also a reminder of everything he was fighting to protect. The simple fact was that running or hiding wouldn't solve their problem. It would only postpone the inevitable confrontation with people who had unlimited resources and no conscience. "There has to be another way," Alex said, his voice carrying more conviction than he felt. "You said Daniel gathered evidence against these people. Where is it now? Could we use it somehow?" Catherine's eyes flickered with something that might have been hope, but she shook her head slowly. "The FBI has copies of everything, but the originals are in a safety deposit box in Portland. Even if we could get to them, I don't see how that helps us. The case is already built. What we need is a way to survive long enough for justice to take its course." Alex was quiet for a long moment, his mind racing through possibilities and discarding them just as quickly. They were outgunned, outmanned, and running out of time. But giving up wasn't an option as long as Hazel's safety was at stake. Sometimes the only way forward was through the danger, not around it. "What if we could expose them publicly?" he said finally. "Not through the courts, but through the media. Make it impossible for them to operate in the shadows." Catherine stared at him as if he'd suggested they fight fire with gasoline, but Alex could see her mind working behind her dark eyes. "It's incredibly risky," she said slowly. "If we move against them and fail, there won't be a second chance. These people don't just kill witnesses, they make examples of them." Alex felt ice in his veins at her words, but he also felt something else, a grim determination that surprised him with its intensity. He'd spent 4 years building a quiet, safe life for himself and Hazel, but safety was an illusion when evil men decided you were a threat. "Then we'd better not fail," Alex said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Outside, the afternoon shadows were growing longer, and somewhere in the distance, dangerous men were probably closing in on their location. But for the first time since Catherine had appeared on his doorstep, Alex felt like they might have something approaching a plan. It wasn't much, but it was better than waiting to die. The decision to fight back changed everything, transforming his quiet kitchen into a war room and Catherine from a helpless victim into a determined ally. They had perhaps 12 hours before Vincent Morrison and his enforcer tracked them down, 12 hours to turn the tables on people who'd spent their lives believing they were untouchable. It wasn't much time, but Alex had learned in his years as a single father that sometimes the most important battles were won not through superior force, but through superior desperation and the refusal to give up when everything was at stake. As darkness began to fall over their small town, Alex looked at Catherine, really looked at her, and saw not the frightened woman who'd stumbled into his life, but a partner in the fight that would determine whether his daughter grew up safe or became another casualty in someone else's war. Tomorrow would bring violence and danger beyond anything his peaceful existence had prepared him for. But tonight, they would plan and prepare and find whatever courage they needed to protect the innocent and expose the guilty. The scared lady from the restaurant was gone, replaced by someone harder and more determined. And Alex Carter, small-town carpenter and single father, was about to discover reserves of strength and cunning he'd never known he possessed. The real war was just beginning.